Hi, so I'm here today in Craigton Cemetery in the southwest of Glasgow just to talk a wee bit about how doing research into burial registers can help you identify the location of where your ancestor may be buried. And I thought I would just use one of my own as a bit of a case study. So many years ago I became interested in trying to locate the location where my great-great-grandfather Archibald Henderson was buried. Now Archie came from the island of Tiree, migrated to Glasgow in the late 19th century and resided with his family in the sort of plantation area of Govan, the old Govan borough, close to the River Clyde where he would have been working. And he, I thought, would have likely have been buried in Craigton Cemetery, which was the cemetery which served the kind of Govan and the adjacent communities around this area during that period. The Craigton Cemetery opened in the late 1870s. So with that knowledge in mind, I went to the Mitchell Library to try and find a record of his burial. The way I did that was by knowledge of his death. Obviously I knew that he'd passed away in 1903, had clarified that information through the Statutory Register of Deaths. Sometimes if you're lucky, the registers of deaths might include a note to say where the person was buried as well. That I have come across that in the past. For example, my great-great-grandfather's father, Hector Henderson, who died in Tiree in 1855, I think it was, 1854, 1855, I want to say, I think possibly, 1856, he died in 1856, and there's a note on his death certificate that says that he was buried in Sowerby Cemetery by his brother Duncan Henderson was the informant on that. So sometimes that information is recorded, but often it's not. So in this instance, looking for his son, Archie Henderson, who died in Glasgow, I only had the year of his death. So I went along to the Mitchell Library, where they have the registers of burials for most of the cemeteries in Glasgow, which you're able to access on microfilm. And I scrolled through the registers of deaths for Craigton Cemetery for the year 1903 and was able to find him recorded there. So that was great because it gives you, the registers give you an alphanumeric code which relates specifically to the layer that person was buried in. So in this instance, the code I was able to find was X2244. And there was also on the register a note of a burial certificate, an associated burial certificate, which was great because a burial certificate, if you can trace one to a specific person, will tell you who the proprietor of the layer is, and everybody who's in that specific layer, because we're not talking about just one person to a grave here. Oftentimes in the 19th century, if your family had a plot or a layer in a cemetery, that was getting filled normally by about at least 5 people, whilst your family had access to it. And it was obviously one of the interesting things about doing this research is the doors that it opens to other research invariably, because when you're looking for one person, you're undoubtedly going to find more people than you were looking for. So again, as a case study here, I was able to identify my great-great-grandfather was buried in Craigton Cemetery in 1903 with a plot that had the reference X2244. And as I say, I was able to, on the burial register itself, there was also a note of the burial certificate associated with this grave. I was able to look that up and identify that the proprietor of the grave was his wife, at the time anyway, was his wife, my great-great-grandmother, but that also told me exactly who else was in the grave along with my great-great-grandfather, and there was some new discoveries there for me. I was able to discover, for instance, that it was the place of burial of my great-great-granny's first husband, who I've mentioned in another video, was another man from Tiree called John McLean, who passed away. So he was the first to be laid to rest here. Then they had a daughter who I believe was called, I've got a note of it here, yes, Elizabeth Catherine McLean was a wee girl who must have passed away in infancy. She was only 16 months old, and she actually died the same year as her dad, so it's tragic. Must have been tragic for my great-great-granny at that time, in the year 1885, losing her husband, losing her daughter and then her husband within months of each other. And then we have the death of another person who I'd never even heard of before, was a strange surname to me at the time. A wee girl called Margaret Ritchie, who was only 8 months old. So again, I took it upon myself, so I have to discover who these people are. And was able to ascertain that Margaret Ritchie was the granddaughter of my great-great-granny's sister. So again, it's evident that in those days, if your family had access to a lair, then that was just getting used, it was getting filled up as required, really. So there's that wee girl, Margaret Ritchie. There was then my great-great-granny then remarried my great-great-grandfather, as I've mentioned in another video, who was also from Tiree. So he was Archibald Henderson, and he was the man who I was originally looking for. And they had apparently a wee girl, Jessie Cameron Henderson, who passed away after only 7 months. And again, a wee girl who I knew nothing about, hadn't found any record of her in prior research. So in looking for one person, basically, I'm looking for my great-great-grandfather. I've not only found him, but I've found another 4 people as well. And that's fascinating because, as I said, it just really expands your knowledge of your family history. And I was able to try and track down who these other individuals were. And the interesting thing for me is, and particularly to the relation in relation to the deaths of the children who are in this plot, are the causes of death, which really kind of give you a window into the kind of social history of Glasgow at the time. So, for instance, we have the wee girl Elizabeth McLean died of bronchitis after only 8 days, or suffered with it for 8 days. She was 16 months old. Then the wee girl Margaret Ritchie, who was 8 months old, she died from marasmus, which I had to look up, and marasmus is essentially severe malnutrition. So again, really tragic one there. And then Jessie Cameron Henderson, who is a daughter of my great-great-grandfather. She had died of, did Jessie pass away of whooping cough? So again, you're seeing again the late 19th century Glasgow, really high infant mortality rates, particularly of respiratory diseases, whooping cough, and bronchitis, things like pneumonia. All these types of things were rife in Glasgow at the time. And again, I think it's a sort of tragic irony for me when you think about these infant mortalities, is that especially when it came to things like bronchitis, and you're thinking of conditions that people would have been living in, things like whooping cough, bronchitis, etc. Mothers, parents in general would have been desperate to try and keep their children warm. They would have been burning more coal, which would have just exacerbated the sort of dirty air conditions that people were living in at the time. So the more you're trying to keep your children warm, the more you're exacerbating the problem of pollution in the air, which your children are then breathing in. So it's just tragic. But yeah, so a wee window into the kind of social history of Glasgow at the time. And yeah, the burial registers, they'll give you that information as to like who the proprietor of a grave was, and like how at what level each individual was buried at, and as I say, the reference code. So I mentioned these alphanumeric reference codes and how they can assist. So basically, my family were a relatively poor, average working class family living in the Govan plantation area at that time. They weren't able to afford a gravestone, but I've still able to discover the plot or the general area where we think they were laid to rest by this reference, this alphanumeric reference. So I knew the one I was looking for was X2244, and I've come along to Craigton here when I was doing my research a few years ago, and I'll just flip my camera. I was able to find this gravestone, which has got X2251 on it. You'll see a lot of these gravestones have been toppled over deliberately because they've become unsafe. The council, once they took ownership of Craigton Cemetery, pushed a lot of these over, which is a shame. I think they did it to protect, well, for safety reasons, but also to protect the inscriptions. They've pushed them over on their fronts, which is not that helpful for genealogy, obviously, but we still are able to access, in some instances, these reference codes, which you'll find sort of usually discreetly placed or carved onto the plinth. And in this instance, there's just a few graves along. Someone else who's been doing some research has identified this one as X2257. So again, I've got 2257, 2251, gives you a rough idea as to which direction the numbering is going in, which enabled me to ascertain that the site over here was roughly the spot where 2244 would have been. So that's this area here. That is the intention. I mean, it would be lovely to have a proper gravestone there commemorating my great-great-grandpa and his family, his extended family. So yeah, that's burial registers, and I can access them for you at the City Archives in Glasgow. So I hope you find that useful.